Luke chapter 1 from verse 5. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Once, when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot according to the custom of the priesthood to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshippers were praying outside. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of the incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I am an old man and my wife is well along in years." The angel said to him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them. They realized he'd seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. When his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and for 5 months remained in seclusion. "The Lord has done this for me," she said. "In these days he has shown his favour and taken away my disgrace among the people." Now from verse 57. When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbours and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he's to be called John." They said to her, "There's no one among your relatives who has that name." Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbours were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, "What then is this child going to be?" For the Lord's hand was with him.
I want to start off to say thanks to the elders and to Tim for giving me the opportunity to come up here today. A couple of weeks ago, Tim sent me a message that said something along the lines of, "The elders are keen to get some of the younger guys up to start preaching, and you came to mind, how does that sound?" And I think my reply was, "That sounds terrifying." Anyway, here I am, so bear with me. I'll just start in prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for the opportunity we have to meet together. I pray that you'll use me today. It'll be your words, not mine. And your spirit will be with us today as we go through this message. I'm going through the story of Zechariah leading up to Zechariah's song at the end of chapter 1, which Tim will lead us through later. But Luke starts with a pretty good introduction into who we're dealing with here. So Zechariah was a priest in the division of Abijah, and Elizabeth was also of the priestly line in Aaron. Both of them are righteous in the sight of God, observing all of the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. They were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. So the first thing that comes to mind when I read this part of the passage is how completely opposite Zechariah's situation is to Mary, who Soph talked about last week. Young or old, God really is using anyone, so we can't get out of it. Zechariah and Elizabeth are pretty top-notch Jews. They're both from families of priests from the line of Aaron, and Zechariah's a priest himself. They've dedicated their lives to serving God and upholding the law. I'm sure we all can think of an older couple, could be at this church or somewhere else, that quietly go about their days serving God. When you speak to them, they just seem to say the right things and pray the right things. They're sort of unofficial leaders in the community, and this is how I picture Zechariah and Elizabeth. However, they were never able to have a child, and I think it's hard for us today, especially those my age, to understand the gravity of this. Our culture is completely different to the culture of Zechariah and Elizabeth. And I know this because one of the most common questions Rach gets asked as a new mother is, when are you going back to work? Today, if a woman wasn't able to have a child, it wouldn't be as big of an issue. There's plenty of options for them. You could focus on your career. You could maybe do IVF or adopt. But the choices for women in Elizabeth's time were limited. There was no IVF, and your occupation was stay-at-home mother or stay-at-home mother. Children were and seen as a gift from God, and as Elizabeth couldn't fall pregnant, the narrative at the time was that God must be punishing her for something that she had done. And this would have brought a lot of suffering and shame to Zechariah and Elizabeth. In verse 8, we find Zechariah at the temple. It was his priestly division's turn to be on shift, and so he was away from home for about a week. By chance, he had the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to go into the sanctuary inside the temple to light incense on the altar. And this is where he encounters the angel of the Lord. Now, previous to this encounter was a period known as the 400 years of silence. This is a period where there had been no new prophecies or signs from God. So I'm sure as Zechariah and Elizabeth had questioned God's plans, the whole of Israel at this point would be questioning what is going on or where is God. The angel says to Zechariah, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of this. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord. And he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." The angel tells Zechariah that both his prayer and the prayers of Israel have been heard. They will have a son, and he will prepare the way for the Lord. Now we know Zechariah was a priest, and he was getting on in his years. So at this point in life, he probably knew his scriptures pretty well. He knew God had a plan for Israel, and that God had been using unlikely people throughout the whole Old Testament history. I mean, the whole story echoes of Abraham and Sarah, the ones who the whole Jewish nation have been founded on. However, he still couldn't believe it, even in the face of an angel. Now, this is where I often find myself, and you may find yourself sometimes as well. I too have access to all the scriptures, although I certainly don't claim to know them like an old Jewish priest. But I know God's promises to those who follow him, yet even, especially in times of hardship, I'll question God's plan. At this point, Zechariah questions God's plan for his life. In verse 18, he says, "How can I be sure of this?" The angel of the Lord Gabriel gives Zechariah a sign. He takes away his ability to speak until the prophecy has been fulfilled. Now, my daughter Tallulah is not of an age where she is questioning. However, I've led most of your kids at either church or Livewire or at Bible study, and having the power to take someone's voice away would be oh so useful. In my original notes, I had this event as more of a punishment for Zechariah's unfaithfulness to God. However, on Thursday, I rewrote the whole sermon, and I see this now as more an opportunity for Zechariah. He can no longer talk, but only listen to God. As we see further on, he certainly would have spent a lot of time in the Word and in prayer. Now, the next part of the story is one of those passages in the Bible where if you put yourselves in the shoes of the characters, you realize how ridiculous it actually is. In verse 23, it says, when Zechariah, when his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant for 5 months and remained in seclusion. So Zechariah comes home from his week at the temple, and he can no longer speak, and somehow has to try and convince his wife that an angel has told him to have a baby with him. Surely this is the true miracle of the passage, because Elizabeth does fall pregnant. "The Lord has done this for me," she said. "In these days he has shown his favour and taken away my disgrace among the people." You can almost feel the elation in Elizabeth's words. This burden that is plaguing this couple for their whole life, causing lots of suffering, has been lifted. We then move to verse 57, the birth of John the Baptist. When it was time for Elizabeth to have a baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbours and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father, Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he's to be called John." They said to her, "There's no one among your relatives who has that name." Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." Immediately, his mouth was open and his tongue was set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbours were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, what then is this child going to be? For the Lord's hand was with him. Now, Zechariah at this point had been silent for maybe up to a year now, so he had a long time to think things through. He probably spent a long time in the scriptures and in prayer, and he's been able to see God's plan play out in his life. And he was obedient to God's request in the naming of his son, John, which means God is gracious. This part of the passage is a real encouragement for me. With the loss of Tom this year, I know me and my family are still sometimes back in that temple questioning God's plan. But in this story, we can see God does have a plan. It is his plan, not our plan, and it is in his timing, not our timing. Zechariah and Elizabeth had to live through a lifetime of suffering and shame while humbly serving God before being able to see God's plan in their lives. We may be going through terrible suffering, financial difficulty, breakdown of relationship, or a death in the family, but God does have a plan for all of us, and we may not see it now, and it may not be in this lifetime, but at some point it will be clear to us. And like Zechariah and Elizabeth, at some point we'll be in a place where we just want to sing. Thank you.